Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce to you a fellow that I met about a year or so ago when I was making plans for a May trip. Our speaker, Ben Kent, was born and raised in Saratoga region of New York State. He is a living historian, speaker, and researcher who has been featured on C-SPAN, PBS, National Park Service programs, and the 2020 History Channel documentary about Ulysses S. Grant. And he's been assigned to the summer home since 2014. Ben is chosen for his topic tonight, a Yankee, galvanized Yankee, the man who fought on both sides of the Civil War. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Ben Kemp.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate Al and the General Lander Civil War Roundtable for having me on this evening. It's always a wonderful opportunity to share the research and the interesting stories that I come across. Sometimes that's during my association with Grant Cottage as a historic site, and in this case, it's actually not. It was in my association with the Hadley Lake Luzerne. Those are two townships just down the road from me in the southern Adirondack Mountains. The Hadley Lake Luzerne Historical Society. I was a board member for a few years, and this individual that we'll be talking about tonight had an association there. But of course, I want to recognize the Civil War Roundtable there for the very important work that you do to keep the Civil War era alive, keep it in people's minds, to remember those, the sacrifices that were made, and just to appreciate the history of it that much more. So I really appreciate the role that your organization plays. And my fascination with the Civil War really is a little different than some people. Some people are a little bit more fascinated with the battles, the leaders, and I do work at a leader's final home, and he was writing about the Civil War there. But for me, I became a Civil War reenactor when I was a teenager. You know, Ken Burns' Civil War series, the Glory, Gettysburg, the movies. Everybody was interested, but what really fired my imagination, especially about those movies, was really the stories that came out of the common soldier, and some of them were complex, you know, depending on the background of that soldier. And tonight's story is going to be like that. It's going to be particularly focused on an individual soldier who had an incredibly unique Civil War experience. From what I've, from my research, I haven't found anyone else in the annals of the Civil War history that had the exact same experience. Everyone's unique, but this one's a little more unique. We'll put it that way. I'm really, really glad to have, this is not a luxury you get every time when researching Civil War soldiers, to have a photograph of them, especially a photograph during the wartime. I was so fortunate to find this photograph when I started researching the individual, and I reached out to the owner and they gave me permission to use it, which was wonderful. And he looks like such a young man, doesn't he? This is Hugh Clements. This is going to be our main character tonight of this story. And again, just to be able to look into the face of the individual we're talking about, it's very important. You know, the internet has really made research so much better, and this is a great example of that. It's so much more evocative to look at this young man. I believe in this photograph, he's somewhere around 20, but to me looks like he's about 16. I don't know. Maybe I'm just getting old. So that's Hugh Clements, and we're gonna learn some about him and his unique tale. So where does Hugh Clements come from? Where does he originate? Well, he was born in July of 1842, and he is a native of New England. So I figured I'd bring that up. Just barely, though. If you can see the photograph on the left, there's a map showing the very, very western county, Rutland County in Vermont, right by the New York border. So just about as far west in New England as you can get, in a little farming town called Wells, which I've actually been to and been part of a reenactment there once years ago. So I'm familiar with it. He didn't spend too much time there. That was just his very young childhood. And he moved not too far, but certainly over the border into New York. He had 5 sisters and 1 older brother, Martin Van Buren. Clements was his name, and he was born during that president's tenure. But he'll come back in our story a little bit later. We'll talk about Hugh's older brother. His father, Hugh's father, was a farmer and a Methodist minister. They settled in a place called Ferguson Hollow, but it's only probably about 10 miles north of where I live, just in the southern Adirondacks, in a place called Lake Luzerne. And there is a lake there, and that's where the 2 major rivers of the Adirondacks come together there, the Hudson and the Sacandaga. And it's a massive, it was massively important for the timber trade back in the 19th century. So they would float the logs down the river and then process them. So it was a huge timber area. But there was a lot of other industry going on as well, and that's where he's going to spend his childhood, really in the streams, the forests, you know, and having a fairly normal childhood, from what I can tell. Not a lot of information left from that time period. Coincidentally, it's only going to be about 10 miles, as the crow flies, from where Hugh Clements grew up, was raised more or less, in Luzerne, to Grant Cottage on Mount McGregor. So it's a very short distance, and that's going to play into our story towards the very end, actually. This is where it gets really strange, and the mystery comes in here. And I'm going to warn you that even with 5, 6, 7 years of research on this, the research continues. There are some major mysteries still in this, as you may know, people that aren't quite as prominent individuals, characters in our history, well, they just don't have as much of a paper trail usually. And if they didn't leave a diary or a lot of correspondence, then we really have to go with just the basics that we can glean off of different genealogical information and census records, things like that. And that's what I've done here for the most part. And one thing I found out was that as a very young man, in 1858, just a few years before the war breaks out, Hugh is going to move to Valdosta, a brand new county seat in Lowndes County in southern Georgia. He's going to move there with his sister Martha, it's an older sister, and his brother-in-law Elijah Ives. For what reason? Absolutely unknown. Absolutely unknown. They're moving from the mountains of northern New York to the coastal plains of southern Georgia. I mean, they're only 13 miles from the Florida border, and they're 60 miles from the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, this is way down there, a completely different environment. It must have been an incredible shock, but the place was growing. There was a new railroad coming to town. Again, it was becoming the county. It was named the county seat. So there was a lot of potential going on there, a lot of activity, a lot of people moving into the area. So it was a flurry of activity just before the Civil War. To give you an idea of the culture shock, I mean, you're talking about a county that's predominantly a cotton producing area, and the population of the county was 50% enslaved individuals. It was definitely a different environment than they had been born and raised in. Now, I have found no connections between the Ives family, the Clements family, and anyone in Georgia. So it remains an incredible mystery. Literally, 1,000 miles at least between the 2 points. I did find recently a couple of individuals in the town that did have some ties to Vermont and New York. So they owned some sort of a business in town. I think it was a hotel or a boarding house. So maybe I'll go down that road and see if there's any connections. So it wasn't unknown that there was a northerner that would move into a place like this, but it was predominantly, according to the census record, it was mostly native-born Southerners and Georgians in this area of southern Georgia. So you would have stuck out a little bit, like a little bit of a sore thumb, with their northern accent. Their Yankee accent would have been apparent. What are they going to do down there? What are they going to do? Well, Hugh is very young, and I would imagine not. there's no evidence that he had any particular trade when he went down there that I know of. But he went into he worked at a mill and was working as a cooper. And so he's building pails, barrels, or whatever they had him doing in that, just basic manual labor, more or less, semi-skilled. And then Elijah is an interesting character. He's going to open up a confectionery, which kind of, it deals with sweets, possibly some pastries, maybe even some baked goods, depending on the size of the business. And that's what he's going to do. He's going to be the candy man, basically, of town, in this new town. He's going to live in a town just next door called Quitman by the 1860 census. So they've kind of split a bit. Hugh is not living with his sister and brother-in-law. He's living kind of boarding at the mill, more or less, in Valdosta, and they're about 18 miles away to the west in Clements, but close enough where obviously they could, still interact with each other, and they obviously did. But it's a place where you can't hide that you're a Yankee. There's no question. It really fires the imagination. What was it like for them to live in this kind of alien environment, at that time? Just prior to the Civil War, because anyone who studies Civil War history knows that there was already a substantial political and social and cultural divide between the North and the South. And then in this time, you also have discussions about secession and war going on, even prior to 60, 61. So they would have, I don't know how much it was talked about in the town. Who knows if it was a subject there, but it's interesting to think about. Now, the fact that they were in Georgia is one mystery. The second big mystery is, why did they stay? Why did they stay past the point that may have seemed like a point of danger? So you have on the left is a illustration of this exciting new railroad coming to town. It's going to boost business. As I mentioned, it was a growing community. It says Railroad Jubilee at Valdosta, but right below it, and this is in August of 1860, it says disunion upon the event of Lincoln's election. So as this exciting, community information is being posted, also this incredibly sobering and serious discussion of secession and disunion. And so that's right on the same page. So obviously that both would have been the talk of the town at the time. So they're going to stay. You have Georgia decides to secede in January of 1861. And you can see the Ordinance of Secession on the right. And so they weren't the very first to secede, but they were fairly early on. And Georgia is, at that point, what's going through their heads? What's going through Hugh's head and his brother-in-law Elijah? What are they thinking at this time? One easy why were they going to stay? Well, you've obviously got Elijah established in business. He's been there a couple of years. It's not a small thing in that time and age to walk away from a business that an enterprise you've set up. So I think that could be part of it. Also, as most people know that study the Civil War and in the beginnings of it, there was a fairly large component of people, both North and South, that thought that it wouldn't be much. There wouldn't be much to this. In the South, there was a lot of talk of, we're just going to make we'll threaten, we'll posture, and then the North will relent and allow the secession. But there was a lot of people that didn't take it as seriously, and perhaps Hugh and Elijah, because they had invested something down there of themselves and created a bit of a life and probably some friends down in that area in southern Georgia, they probably didn't just want to up and walk away from that unless they absolutely had to. But their decision to stay in southern Georgia was certainly going to affect their lives dramatically over the next few years. So what do they get for staying in southern Georgia? Well, we have some records that start up in early 62, but we have the claims later on of Hugh himself, who claims that him and his brother-in-law were pressed into the Confederate service. And, the term pressed into is Somewhat vague. I mean, it's vague to a point where, we don't know all the conditions. Now, the enlistments that happened, the recruitment enlistments that happened in southern Georgia at this time were part of the building up the 13th Georgia Infantry, and that was the Piscola Volunteers. It's all a little confusing because the state accidentally made a second 13th Georgia and sent them to Virginia, and they're both trying to be the 13th Georgia at once. So eventually they would be combined. At least the portion that Elijah and Hugh would be in would end up, that 13th Georgia would be part of it that they were in would be melded into the 26th Company C of the 26th Georgia Infantry by early of 1862. Now, it's possible, we don't have any records to prove it, but Hugh and Elijah may have been pressed into the service as far back as the summer of 1861. We don't have any records from there all the way till early 62. So were they part of the 13th? 13th spent time at St. Simon's Island, right on the coast of Georgia. They didn't go into any active service before 62, but we know they were. It's possible that they were with the unit at that time. It's also possible that it came around the time of the Conscription Act, which was in 1862. So the Conscription Act was in April 1862. And it required all residents 18 to 35 to serve 3 years or the duration of the war. For those who voluntarily enlisted before they were conscripted, if I can say that right, there was a $50 bounty. Now, one thing that's telling in Hugh's record when it starts in May of 1862 is there was no bounty listed. So that they may lend some credence to the fact that he did not enlist. Whether he was conscripted or not, that's debatable. He was above 18 or over, obviously, and below 35, and so was his brother-in-law. So they could be that they were conscripted, and that's what he termed as being pressed into the service. I'm not sure. So that's going to be another little mystery. But it does seem as though he didn't, at least his claims seem to be honest later in his life, that he really did not want to be part of the war. In that way. So they were set up 130 miles, as I mentioned, on the coast, 130 miles east of where they were living. Once they're in this environment, no matter how they got there, what is it like for you? What's it like? How did he get along day to day with his fellow soldiers? I would have to, was there a desire to escape immediately? Was he concerned about his life, his brother-in-law's life? What was the concern here? And it's hard to imagine. He said it wasn't willing, so there obviously was some reticence for him to serve. And so you have to think he's going to probably treat the people around him with normal respect, I would imagine, just as fellow soldiers. But at the same time, did those soldiers look on him a different way because he was a Yankee? Did they mistrust him? So there's a lot that goes into it, and really kind of plays to that idea that the Civil War, as we know, was not as clear cut. There was a lot of gray areas, and in this case, gray and blue. They're going to get organized and be sent north, and they're going to be up there in 62 during the Peninsula Campaign. They're going to see their first action in pretty quickly. I mean, within a couple of weeks of arriving in Virginia. They're going to be part of the Peninsula Campaign, countering McClellan's push up the peninsula. The regiment at the time was at full strength, 1,100. Their commander on the right there is at the time it would become a brigadier. It was Brigadier General Alexander Lawton. He would become a brigadier general, and coincidentally, he would die in upstate New York. Out of all, he was a West Pointer though. He had gone to West Point, but he was a Southern man. The largest brigade in the Army at the time, it was actually made up of 5 Georgia regiments, and they were assigned to, not a hard guess there, we see Mr. Stonewall Jackson to the left. They were part of the Stonewall Brigade. I'm sorry, Stonewall Jackson's Corps, I should say at this time. So Jackson ended up arriving late at the Battle of Gaines Mill in late June. The 26th would be a part of an evening assault on the Union lines. But it wasn't a there was certainly, it would have been seeing the elephant, as they say, their first combat experience, but it wasn't a particularly costly battle for the regiment or the brigade. Again, all these questions rush into your mind when you're dealing with someone in this predicament. Hugh who doesn't want to be there, but he is. He finds himself in this place he probably never dreamed he'd be. And then he's got Northern men. He knows there's Northern men on the other side of the battlefield, and they're shooting at him. And, was the training enough? How much fear was there? Was there a strange sense of morality, or was it just survival? I mean, what were these things? And I think that's what fires my imagination the most is what was Hugh thinking at these moments, especially his first time facing the gun, which is terrible enough. Ulysses S. Grant, would say his first, he was certainly not as brave as you'd think on his first meeting in the Mexican War, his first combat experience, with the bullets whizzing around. So this is going to be a fairly light introduction as the Civil War terms goes to that, but that's not going to be the case in August. In August, they're going to have a terrible fight. It's on the evening of the 28th of August at Bronner's Farm. This was the opening engagement of the Second Battle of Bull Run. This is going to be a ferocious fight at Bronner's Farm. The two sides are battling furiously, less than 100 yards apart from each other, just for hours. Neither side letting up. General McClellan is actually commented on the brigade of the Union Brigade that was made up of Western soldiers that was opposite Lawton's brigade, where Hugh was, saying that they must be made of iron. And that's going to earn them the famous moniker, the Iron Brigade. So Lawton's brigade is going to face the Iron Brigade. And as you can see in the map there, you can see that the 76th New York was on the same area of the battlefield as the 26th Georgia. So you had New York troops, not just Northern troops, New Yorkers, fellow New Yorkers, right across on the other side of the battlefield. So I'll share a little excerpt of the experience because, again, we don't have Hugh's letters. We don't have exact experience. So we take the battle report, and this gives us a little idea of what Hugh would have experienced at his first massive bloody conflict. It must have been terrifying. This is from the Savannah Republican. It says, while the opportunity presents itself, I cannot refrain from writing a few lines commemorative of the gallantry of the 26th Georgia Regiment upon the bloody and well-contested field of Manassas. On Thursday, the 28th of August, 1862, just before dark, on the evening of the 28th, the 26th was drawn up in line of battle in a skirt of woods near the battlefield. We marched steadily across an open field for 400 or 500 yards, through which the balls were flying by thousands without firing a single shot. Men were constantly falling from the ranks, but our brave Georgians wavered not. As a man fell, his place was immediately filled by another, and the regiment moved steadily to the front. As we neared the enemy, General Jackson rode up behind the brigade and urged us by the memory of our noble state to one bold stroke, and the day would be ours. And gallantly did the brave men to whom he was speaking obey his orders. Volley after volley was poured into the ranks of the enemy with terrible effect. Still, they held their ground, and our ranks kept getting thinner and thinner. After firing several rounds, General Lawton gave orders for the brigade to fix bayonets and charge the enemy. At the command, every man bounded over a fence which separated them from the enemy, and with the true Georgia yell, rushed upon them. Then it was that the 26th suffered so terribly. Men fell from the ranks by dozens, still they wavered not. It was a heart-sickening sight to me as I gazed upon the regiment when formed after the battle. The 26th Georgia lost 12 commissioned officers and 125 non-commissioned officers and privates. To give you an idea, that sounds dramatic, and it is. And a lot of times these accounts, obviously try to put it in the most gallant light, but there's no getting around it. The statistics don't lie. The 26th Georgia sustained an absolutely staggering 74% casualty rate at Bronner's Farm. And to think that this is their second engagement, that's like Irish Brigade level, that's incredible. If anybody knows anything about the Irish Brigade, they were recklessly brave, we'll put it that way. And so there's no question, Hugh statistically was lucky to make it out of this conflict alive. Whether or not he let out the Georgia yell, I don't know. I don't know if he really had it in him. but certainly he did what he needed to survive. So that was an incredible baptism of fire for, literally only a couple months after they had left the seacoast in Georgia. They're facing this massive bloody battle. And of course, the fall rolls around and they're on to the next terrible day in the Civil War, which is the Battle of Antietam in Sharpsburg, Maryland. And so you've got Robert E. Lee's making his foray into northern soil. It kind of begs the question, and I'll bring this up later, though, this is getting pretty close to Union territory. If you are Hugh and you do have a kind of an urge to escape, this might be an opportunity, but we don't see it happening here. There's going to be the battle at Antietam. As you can see in the map, Lawton's brigade is in the center of the action there. You've got a whole line of New Yorkers that they're facing. So again, they're looking at New Yorkers on the battlefield across from them. I'll read again a little excerpt. So at 10 p.m. on the 16th, Lawton's brigade advanced from its position west of the Dunkard Church and relieved Wofford's brigade of Hood's division in the fields south of the cornfield and east of the Hagerstown Pike. Skirmishers were thrown forward in the south edge of the cornfield. In this position, the brigade was attacked at about 5:30 a.m. on the 17th by Seymour's brigade of Meade's division on the right, and at 6 a.m. by 3 brigades of Doubleday's division on the left. After losing its commander and more than one half its members, it was relieved by Wofford's brigade of Hood's division and withdrawn to the woods southwest of the Dunkard Church and was not again engaged. So it in a seemingly very short period of time, there was incredible, another battle where they sustained incredible casualties, which again, only a month after, barely a month after, if not even after their terrible ordeal in Virginia. Here they are in Maryland, having another trial by fire. You have 30 miles south of the Pennsylvania border. So you're in a border state, Maryland, and then you have Pennsylvania only 30 miles north. So there was an opportunity perhaps there. Not sure if the time wasn't right, I guess. I mean, the battlefield's a dangerous place. There's going to be some other hardships besides battle that Hugh and his comrades, I guess you can call them comrades, his fellow soldiers, Confederate soldiers, are going to suffer. And that's on the campaign in 1862 in the fall, in the winter of 1862. Now, there's a lot of, as you know, there was suffering in the Civil War, obviously, but there was a lot of exaggeration that goes on sometimes in reports and things. Obviously, if you want to get, you kind of think of what the movie Glory, and he goes in to get the supplies, the shoes, and he's like, "You better give me the shoes." That famous scene. The idea was there was issues with supply of basic needs, clothing items, and that obviously 26 Georgia was not immune to that. James Blaine, and again, you've got the biggest killer in the Civil War lurking there too, which is disease, of course, and so any kind of clothing issues and all that feeds into the possibility of getting sick, malnourishment, exposure, all that's going to play into it. And James S. Blaine, captain of Company A, 26 Georgia, writes to the Savannah Republican, essentially writing home, "Dear sir, we are frequently surprised by receiving letters from home congratulating us upon being so well prepared for a winter campaign in Virginia. This is probably true with regard to most of the Georgia troops in Virginia, but in reference to Lawton's brigade, it is far from the truth. Lawton's brigade is composed of the 13th, 26th, 31st, 38th, 60th, and 61st Georgia regiments, and I venture to assert that a more gallant set of men were never embodied under one command. At the last report from our brigade, we had 705 men without shoes, and there are numbers without a single blanket to shelter them from the cold. This is no fiction, but a simple statement of the truth. Georgians, think of this. Think of such a number of these men who have aided in making the name of Georgia illustrious, whether they wanted to or not, marching 20 and 25 miles per day with nothing to shelter their feet from the contact with the snow, frost, and rocks, and without a blanket to shelter them from the chilling blast at night, and this too without a murmur at their hard fate." Now, there's probably a few murmurs, but I'll forgive them on that, So where the soldiers didn't have anything to do if they didn't have a little complaining to do. So you think of the bonding experience that probably occurred with Hugh through these hardships. that just naturally happen. Doesn't mean he believes fully in what he's doing. Is he really believe in the Southern cause? No, but he has the basic probably human sympathy for his fellow human next to him that's suffering and shivering through the night just as he has. Did he form close friendships? There's obviously no records that he reached out to anybody from his former unit after, the Southern unit after the war, but he could have formed some friendships that ended with the other individual dying. Hugh himself is going to have a very close brush while he's still got the gray uniform on. He's going to have a brush with death at Fredericksburg in December of '62. His luck is going to run out after those two horrific fights. We don't know what the wound was. We have the records to show that he was wounded severely enough that he needed a 20-day furlough for recovery. He was granted a 20-day furlough for recovery. And so that's what we know. So he certainly did receive a wound of some kind. We know it was a wound and not just an illness. It was actually a wounding. So Fredericksburg, again, obviously these Georgians were involved in most of the major conflicts here going on in Virginia in the Eastern Theater here. Battle of Chancellorsville, Lawton's Brigade, and this is in May of '63, so he survives through the winter. And in '63, the Lawton's Brigade was transferred to, as you can see there, John B. Gordon's brigade, who coincidentally was an attendee at Ulysses S. Grant's funeral in 1885 in New York City. They fought at Chancellorsville and 2nd Winchester in the spring of '63. We'll move on from that. And this is where it gets really interesting. So after that battle, we're going to have Hugh taking an opportunity. The Gettysburg campaign's going on. This is the first time they're really, stepping foot on true Northern soil in Pennsylvania. And Hugh's going to take this opportunity to escape the Confederate Army. He probably picked an opportune time because he slunk away, maybe in the night, we don't know, from the Confederate forces as they approached Gettysburg. So this is prior to Gettysburg. He's going to be picked up on July 3rd, the third day of the battle, at Hanover, Pennsylvania, about 13 miles from the terrible carnage going on at Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. So you think about as he's surrendering, depending on the location, 13 miles, he probably was hearing the guns, the massive cannonade that happened just prior to the Pickett's charge on the field of Gettysburg. Because he's got nobody trusted anybody. It was a Civil War, right? You couldn't trust anybody. Everybody's Americans, but you've got people, with Northern accents and Southern accents. I mean, Ulysses S. Grant had a wife that owned slaves. There was a lot of distrust, and it took quite a bit. So to have somebody, I can imagine them arresting him, right, or capturing him in his Confederate uniform and saying, "Boy, you really don't sound like you're from Southern Georgia." I don't think he'd spent enough time down there to pick up the accent. Maybe he did. I don't know, but he probably didn't sound like it. But you can't say, "Oh, I'm just playing dress up for the day." They take him over to Baltimore, and he's going to be confined at Fort McHenry with other prisoners of war from the Gettysburg campaign, mainly. So he's at Fort McHenry first, but then he's shortly after sent to Fort Delaware. He immediately made his situation known, that he was a Northerner. He was pressed into service. He told the authorities that. It was reported that he did, and then he intended. This is one of the most important points. He intended to join the Union Army. Didn't necessarily have to. And then we get into the subject of galvanized. It did happen both ways. There were Northern soldiers that galvanized and became Confederates. Most of the time, galvanizing occurred, swearing oath of allegiance to the other side and serving in their forces. Most of the time, it was just simply to escape the hell that was prison camps, whether North or South. It was anything to get out. I mean, you would do anything to get out of those conditions, literally anything. If you've ever read any books about those prison camps, whether Camp Douglas, Andersonville, you name it. So that's what's going to be the motivating factor for most galvanized soldiers. Now, there is a relatively small number of galvanized soldiers compared to how many soldiers served in the Civil War. About 5,600 Confederates galvanized throughout the Civil War. That's a very small number overall. And about 1,600 Union are known to have gone the other way. Most of them pressed or really forced into it. But it was pretty much coercion one way or the other, whether it just be the conditions of the POW camps. The exchanges broke down in early '63, as you know, prisoner exchanges. So that really pushed the envelope as well. And that's when, a lot of the galvanizing happened after that point. So swallowing the dog was the kind of the derogatory term for galvanizing, because you have to, make this huge, horrible commitment to a cause that you don't agree with, that you didn't sign up for. So it was called swallowing the dog. That's what they called galvanizing back then. And it's a little confusing when you research it, because they called galvanized Yankees, Union soldiers that became Confederates were called galvanized Yankees, and so were Confederates that galvanized to become Union. And so it's a little confusing. Both sides were incredibly wary, including General Grant, of their galvanized soldiers, of their loyalty. So they 99% of Confederate galvanized Union soldiers, they were used in the Western outposts to guard against Native American attacks. And so that's where they were put, so that they wouldn't, one, desert, or two, actually defect, back to the other forces again, or whatever it may be. So for instance, in December of '64, some, galvanized Confederates, Unions that became Confederates, actually threw down their arms, a whole group of 250, and surrendered in the face of Union charge. So certainly these concerns were well-founded. General Grant actually said in his opposition, he said, it's not right to expose them where, to be taken prisoners, they might surely suffer as deserters. So there's it's the same idea as the African-American soldiers. There was an extra punishment that may be in store for them. In September, Hugh is going to take the oath of allegiance, and he's going to join the Company E of the 3rd Maryland Cavalry. His recruiting officer is on the left. And does anybody, his name is Captain Andrew J. Pemberton. And he's an interesting character, because does anybody recognize the guy on the right? He's the commander at Vicksburg, and his name is General John C. Pemberton. This is an interesting small world situation. So you've got the commander of Hugh Clements' new company of the 3rd Maryland Cavalry of galvanized Yankees. His brother is the commander that surrendered to General Grant at Vicksburg. They both grew up in Philadelphia. For some reason, his brother went with the Confederacy. I don't know the whole story, and he went with the Union, obviously. Not that unusual. Grant's father-in-law was, Southerner and Confederate, and his brother-in-law, though, was a Union soldier. So it's certainly families, as you know, were split up by the war. A couple of individuals down at the Fort Delaware Society definitely helped a lot with the research, on galvanized Yankees, and specifically about the Company E of the 3rd Maryland Cavalry. What's going to be really interesting and incredibly unique about the Company E 3rd Maryland Cavalry, they proved everything right, as I'll mention. The galvanized Yankees couldn't be trusted, but except if they're Yankee galvanized Yankees, we'll find that out. But they were the only Confederate galvanized Yankees, I should say, to ever see active combat service against other Confederates. So this smaller band company actually saw service. The rest of them, again, all sent out west. So that makes Hugh's story another level of unique. And then we're going to, obviously we're already at a very unique position with his story. So at the same time that Hugh is joining up, in September of 1863, his brother-in-law, Elijah, who they got separated at some point, he was picked up as a deserter by Union forces at Raccoon Ford in Virginia. He was held at a different prison, Old Capitol Prison in Washington. He was given a chance the next next March in '64. He took the oath of allegiance, and he couldn't return to Georgia, obviously, at this point. There was just no way. So he joined his family, and they show up in the census back up in the Luzerne area in '65. We'll talk about what happens to him later, but he gets to go home. He doesn't join the Union. They just allow him to go back up north. I mean, things were really bad in southern Georgia at that point in '64. I mean, you're talking about food riots, with starving children, Confederate deserters banding together and hiding from authorities. It was really a bad scene in southern Georgia at that time. Again, he's going to stay with the family up in New York. Why was he allowed to go home? Why was Hugh given the same option? These are all interesting questions. Sadly, we find out, and I'm sure that it was very sad for Hugh when he found out that in August of '61, Hugh's older brother, Martin Van Buren, who had stayed back in Luzerne, he had joined the Company D of the 93rd New York Infantry, whose lieutenant colonel was actually Benjamin Clapp Butler, not to be confused with Beast Butler. He would later be instrumental in the development of Luzerne. He was a big, very important person in the community. Hugh's brother died of disease in the fall of '62. It's very likely he didn't even know his brother had died until later in the war, probably after his capture. It's later in '60 for a whole year, probably. He didn't even know his brother was dead. There's no evidence that he fought directly against his brother. However, both units were on the field at Antietam at the same time. So certainly they were, close enough. And but sadly they'd never see each other again. And that's his burial. He's buried, goodness gracious, I'm trying to remember. But he's buried in a national cemetery, I think in Washington. I think he was brought back to Washington. So they decide to take the 3rd Maryland Cavalry. Didn't have horses the whole time, that's the usual. And they took them down way down south. And it did prove to be a bit of a concern, that their concerns were well-founded, because even before they left Maryland, they had a 40% desertion rate among the galvanized Yankees. 40% just once. Well, I don't know. Once they marched out of the compound or wherever, they gone. 40% gone. They lost another 13% basically when they landed down in the South. So in all, over 200 of the 400 who took the galvanized Yankees deserted. Obviously, Hugh was not one of them. The 3rd Maryland was also plagued by a lack of structure and discipline, and they had a lot of infighting amongst the officers. And Captain Pemberton would resign in June of '64. They engaged in the Red River campaign, and in '64, Hugh was assigned as a teamster and a laborer in the ordnance department. So he's doing tasks that probably have him off the front lines, I would imagine, but pretty heavy manual labor. So that summer of '64, Admiral Farragut is he's intent on taking the Mobile Bay. And one of his obstacles was Fort Morgan, and it was besieged in August, and the 3rd Maryland Cavalry took part in that siege. The defenses of the bay were largely captured, but Mobile itself, as some of you may know, actually held out to the very end of the war. So they're in Mobile Bay. Hugh is going to be assigned as a hospital attendant. He's going to at Fort Gaines nearby, and on Dauphin Island from August through all the way through November. And he received an assignment as a detached duty as an aide to the medical purveyor, the Union medical purveyor, Mobile. So they're going to get the medical supplies for the army, and so that's what he's going to be doing. That's what Hugh's going to be doing, and he stayed right in that office, that position, all the way until the end of the war, and just a bit past until June of '65, and was mustered out in Vicksburg in September of 1865. So I guess the time he spent in the Union, although very hot and hard work, was probably a little less terrifying than the 2 years he spent in the Confederate Army, facing some of the most terrible battles of the Civil War. So Hugh is going to come home. He's going to come home. He's going to come right back to Luzerne. We can see him on the map in 1876, about a decade after the war. His parents are still alive, and he's living nearby, just north of the village of Luzerne. Wonder what it would have been like to be away for that many years. Been in the South for a few years, brother lost to the war, and having such a fantastic story to have to relate to your townspeople, people that knew you as a young man, and now you're totally changed. It seems like he was able to settle in well, though. As we know, not all veterans, and I do a program on veterans as well, because not all veterans adjusted well back to civilian life, especially ones that went into the war young. But for whatever reason, he seems to have done really well. Oddly enough, Elijah takes his family back down to southern Georgia. Maybe he had property to recover or whatever, but he stayed down in the South the rest of his life. Him and the family, they ended up dying in Florida. Hugh, however, was done with the South. He never went back. He stayed in Luzerne the rest of his life. He could have received criticism for his time in the Army, but he didn't, that we know of. It seems like he was honest about his experience, and his sincerity really won over the townspeople, and they accepted him fully. He was a family man. He had 4 children. Interestingly enough, one of his children actually lived all the way till 1985. So he married Martha Stewart, not that one, and started a family. They had 3 daughters and a son, as I mentioned. He became a successful businessman and well-respected member of the local community. He was very active in politics, oddly enough, a Democrat in that time, when most Civil War veterans were Republicans. I should say Union veterans, sorry. He was actually a Democratic prohibition candidate for town supervisor in 1896. So he's got a hardware store. He's a businessman. He's very active in all sorts of civic and community organizations, fraternal organizations, obviously just well received and well loved in his community, despite his service in the Confederate Army, because that was a disqualifier to join the Grand Army. If you know the rules, he actually was allowed to join the Benjamin C. Butler, post number 316 of the Grand Army of the Republic. His wife, Martha, was an auxiliary, active in the Women's Relief Corps Auxiliary, and Hugh served as secretary of the Warren County Veterans Association as well. He was with the Odd Fellows, Ancient Order of the United Workmen. In 1890, he has an ad out in a national paper looking for other members of the 3rd Maryland Cavalry. Who knows if he ever, tried to get any together to correspond with or talk about old times. So those are all the many things he was involved in his community. Again, accepted into the Butler Post. The original book still is scanned in, it exists, of the Butler Post, and his name's right in it. He served as an officer at times. So how does Hugh Clements' life intersect with the life of Ulysses S. Grant? Well, all this big international drama of Grant trying to finish his memoirs on a mountaintop is happening just 10 miles away from his home. And every American would have known about it, but it was in the papers everywhere, but Hugh would have really known about it because he was a veteran. So the veterans, the Grand Army, were preparing. They knew he was dying. They were preparing to be part of the ceremonies. And that's where he's going to have an interaction. So Hugh and a few hand-picked men from the Butler Post GAR are going to be detailed as an honor guard in Saratoga Springs during the funeral procession. They place Grant's body on a train going off the mountain down to Saratoga. They switch trains in Saratoga, and that's where Hugh Clements is going to be standing. You can see there's actually a resolution of respect from the paper. It's actually signed Hugh Clements there, or marked Hugh Clements, just after Grant's death in July of 1885. And there's actually a photograph. Is Hugh in it? Possibly, probably, because that's the actual small mountain train, and they're going to transfer Grant's body over to the train on the right, the larger train, to get him down to New York City. And Hugh's going to be in that crowd somewhere. He's one of the honor guard for this portion of Grant's trip, a few miles south of the mountain in Saratoga Springs. So the man who had once donned gray was donning blue, and he was there to see off the greatest hero of the Union. Hugh himself, his sister and brother-in-law passed away in 1891 and 92 and are buried. They had moved to Orlando, Florida. Oddly enough, a Confederate marker is next to Elijah's grave. Whether or not he requested that or even wanted it there, I don't know. But that's interesting as well. Hugh died in a hospital in Albany, New York, of cancer on Decoration Day, now that we know as Memorial Day weekend in 1910. He was buried in Luzerne Cemetery with full honors. His wife died in 1922, and as I mentioned, his youngest child, Ted, lived until 1985. And when I was giving this talk at Luzerne, there was a family member, a descendant that actually had met Ted when he was still alive. And I'll leave you with a newspaper clipping here of Hugh Clements. And again, it's always, a little gushing with these obituaries and messages, but it seems like this is fairly heartfelt. Hugh Clements has gone, but the influence of his upright life, his sterling character, and public spirit will live after him. His high and unyielding sense of honor, integrity, and righteousness, his quick perception, sound judgment, and splendid foresight always gave value to his counsel for the present and future good of the community. Without deliberately looking backward through the years of his active, vigilant, and influential connection with the affairs of this village of ours, we fully comprehend and appreciate his distinguished service to his fellow men. Surely Luzerne has lost one of her most manly men. That's from the local newspaper, the Warrensburg News. So certainly he was beloved in his community. He was a pillar of his community after he came back. So the traumatic experiences he went through, being pressed into the Confederate service, witnessing the horrors of war, he was still able to put that behind him and live a very fulfilling and very meaningful life for, helping his community. I always got to, end, but I got to end with a little pitch. We're not too far out of the way. There's lots of history to see in the Saratoga area, so I do invite you to come and see us. We're open in probably Memorial Day this year. We got some construction going on, but we have probably Memorial Day is when we'll open, and we will be open through October of 2023. And we hope that you'll be able to come and experience the cottage. It's a really special place. Beautiful views, amazingly preserved history in the cottage, and a great visitor center and displays as well. But again, the setting is absolutely stunning. So I definitely recommend that. And of course, we have more information on our website, grantcottage.org. One last thing I'll show you is I mentioned this to Al before. I did find I got this from auction. I just picked it up because it was a veterans item. And it turns out it says post number 5, Department of Massachusetts. That would have been the General Lander post. So this individual actually has ties to your wonderful museum, which I hope to see at some point there, the GAR Hall in Lynn. Don't know who it is for sure. I found somebody that seems to fit the bill, but there's some problems with it. It is a Smith name, so that's an issue. But this is a business card, calling card of O.H. Smith. There is an Ogden H. Smith who has an interesting story, and he was a deserter and had a hard time getting a pension, but he's listed as being a member of the Grand Army Lander Post number 5. So hopefully Al said he'd take a look at the records and see if we could maybe pin this guy down, because Ogden Smith is from, I think, West Newbury, and this other one is Leominster. I got it right. North Leominster, Massachusetts, right? And so, that's a little mystery. And if it's something that the museum would like to have in their collection, I'm fully willing to donate that as well.